Welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing the endocrine system. And the endocrine system consists of a number of different glands that work together to maintain homeostasis in the body. So starting from the top, we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Those are both in the brain, and we're going to have another video that discusses those next. We also have the pineal gland back here that regulates your sleep-wake cycles. We have the thyroid gland, which is at the front of the throat. And on the back of the thyroid gland are four tiny little glands embedded in it called the parathyroid glands. Also included is the thymus and the adrenal glands, which are like little hats that sit on top of the kidneys. The pancreas is a very important endocrine organ. And the gonads, which consist of the testes and the ovaries, which also produce hormones. So the endocrine system is composed of all of these endocrine glands. So what's an endocrine gland? Let's look at the difference between an exocrine gland over here on the right and an endocrine gland over here on the left. An exocrine gland is made out of glandular epithelium, and the cells are all lined up around sort of a central opening, and those cells are going to secrete product. The product will accumulate in this opening called a duct and will leave and be secreted onto some kind of body surface. So the product in an exocrine gland is secreted into a duct. And some examples of that would be the mammary glands, which secrete milk into a duct, and the milk is then secreted out onto the body surface. Another example would be a sweat gland. Sweat glands produce sweat. The sweat leaves through a duct onto the body surface. There are also some intestinal glands that secrete intestinal enzymes into the lumen of the small intestine. Endocrine glands are different. Instead of all of the glandular material surrounding an open area, which then leads to a duct, each of the cells of an endocrine gland are right next to the blood. So when they secrete their product, instead of it all coming together and being secreted out together, each cell is secreting directly into the blood. So all of those glands we just looked at here are going to secrete their product directly into the bloodstream. Now we just finished talking about the nervous system. And in the nervous system, remember, you have a neuron that has a long axon and a terminal end. When we're sending signals, we send an action potential, which we learn is an electrical signal. At the terminal end, we do have chemical signals that are released in the form of neurotransmitter, which is then picked up by either another neuron or some type of effector. These effectors can be either skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, maybe cardiac muscle, or glands. And so the nervous system has a very direct way of causing an effect. And we learned that action potentials travel very fast. They're also direct. So this gap between the terminal end of one neuron and the beginning of another neuron or a different type of effector is very, very small. So this is direct contact, almost. And the chemical signal here is a neurotransmitter. In the endocrine system, however, we have a gland that's going to produce a product directly into the bloodstream, which will then circulate throughout the body. Somewhere in the body is the target cell. So in contrast to the nervous system where it was a direct stimulation, this is a very indirect stimulation, and it can take some time. So the endocrine system is slow, it's indirect contact, and the chemical signal that we're using, not called a neurotransmitter, it's called a hormone. So the nervous system is really quite different than the endocrine system. This being very quick to start and stop, having direct contact, and using neurotransmitters. The endocrine system is slow to start and slow to stop. It uses indirect contact because the hormone has to go through the blood to get to the target cell. And the chemical signal is called a hormone instead of a neurotransmitter. Speaking of target cells, one of the most important things for a hormone is that it only stimulates the target cell. Since hormones are secreted into the blood, and the blood goes everywhere in the body, we have to make sure that these hormones are very specific. Meaning they're only going to bind to the target cells that we want to activate. You can see here that our hormone is little round balls. This is our target cell. This is some other cell in the body that we do not want to stimulate. And you can see that the receptor on the target cell is ideally shaped to bind to our hormone. Whereas other cells don't have the correct receptor and so will not be affected by the presence of the hormone. So when we're talking about specificity, it is whether the correct receptor on the target cell is present that's going to allow us to be specific with our results. The hormones can be one of two types. Imagine you have a cell, and remember the outside of the cell is that phospholipid bilayer. Sometimes hormones are what we call steroid hormones. The hormones of the adrenal glands, the testes, and the ovaries are steroid hormones. And remember that steroid, way back at the beginning of the course, steroids are a type of lipid. They are lipid soluble. And remember that our phospholipid bilayer allows lipids to move through it. So steroid hormones can actually diffuse through the plasma membrane of the cell. They bind to their target inside the cell. Sometimes it can be in the cytoplasm. Sometimes that target can actually be inside the nucleus. And they generally tend to turn on or turn off transcription and translation. Non-steroid hormones or peptide hormones are not lipids. They are generally made out of some kind of protein. Remember, peptide is a short protein. These cannot pass through the plasma membrane because they are polar and they are large. So instead, they bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. This causes some changes inside the cell, and activation happens via what's called a second messenger system. This basically means that instead of the hormone itself binding to the target, the hormone has to bind to a receptor, and the receptor activates something inside the cell to activate transcription and translation. So we have our two types of hormones here: steroid hormones, which are lipids and can enter the cell, and non-steroid hormones, which are not lipids and cannot pass through the plasma membrane and have to bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell. That's it for today. Make sure to come back for Endocrine II, Random Glands, coming up next. See you in class.